Hello, and I want to welcome everybody to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, December 16th. This day is the birthday of the composer Ludwig van Beethoven, who was born 251 years ago today. For the past 3 years, on December 16th, members of the Schiller Institute, including members of the LaRouche organization, members of other have joined with people in the New York area, musicians, instrumentalists, and so on, to commemorate this day. And we want to take up a topic tonight which is called Ludwig van Beethoven, the President of the Human Mind. As a reason we're doing this, if you were with us at the beginning of 2020, you may remember that Helga Sepp LaRouche at the time talked about the idea of the year of Beethoven and was thinking about the year of the presidential elections as needing to be defined by the thinking and the character of the thinking of that great composer. But there was a reason for that. The reason for that is that the thinking of Beethoven had a profound and direct effect on the political practice of this organization because of its profound effect on the thinking of Lyndon LaRouche and on his writings. Many of the things that we do in the way of our proposals, including our tactical proposals, come from a conception of classical thought. Now, this is not a fancied up, gussied up way of trying to talk about some sort of Freemasonic secret knowledge or some kind of method that is as a kind of a recipe that you sell to distinguish yourself from other people. This is rather an attempt to, and was an attempt, a successful attempt by Lyndon LaRouche to reintroduce classical ideas as the subject of political practice. This is something that was part of the way in which the thinking of the American Revolution was shaped. It was not shaped around reactions to taxation or reactions to oppression from England. Those things were true, but that's not how the American Revolution was shaped. The American Revolution was shaped by the figure of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was one of the greatest scientists of Europe and definitely a greater scientist than Isaac Newton, which is something which would both shock and amuse those people who think of themselves as running university physics programs, but nonetheless it's the case. And his inheritance, that is Franklin's inheritance of the scientific networks of the great Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the inventor of the calculus and the inventor of the science of physical economy. Franklin's inheritance of the networks of that scientist were the basis for what became the American Revolution, which was an international enterprise. It's not merely that people like Baron von Steuben from Germany or Thaddeus Kosciuszko and Casimir Pulaski from Poland and Marquis de Lafayette from France were involved. Sure, that's kind of what people like to say about it, but that's not why it was international. It was international because of the networks of Benjamin Franklin and the way in which he collaborated with the greatest minds of his day. In the case of Franklin in specific, with Mozart, who wrote a set of compositions for a musical instrument called the glass harmonica, invented by Benjamin Franklin, and did so as a way of identifying his solidarity with the concepts of the American Revolution. It wasn't merely some sort of promotional gimmick. These ideas and the idea of revolution, the idea of progress, is way, way different than what people have been caused to sort of run the gauntlet in the United States for many years outside of this organization and outside of what Lyndon LaRouche introduced. Why is that relevant to tonight when you look at things like the recent meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin? Why is it relevant when we look in a different way at the recent meeting between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin? These of course, were Zoom conference calls, not physical meetings. Why is it relevant when we look at the actual challenge that's actually posed by not the Omicron variant of the coronavirus, but by the implications of what we've been seeing for the past 2 years as a kind of new eruption beyond what we saw during the AIDS period of the 1980s, with a disease, the human immunodeficiency virus, which had actually appeared no later than the 1920s, not the 1980s, as people believe, or the 1970s. A disease which was ignored precisely because the conditions of imperialism and colonialism and imperial colonial practice toward Africa made it irrelevant that people in that continent, black people in that continent in particular, were dying of it. So it was never looked at. It was never investigated. It was never something that was, a subject of anything. It just never occurred to people that it was important, and therefore, quote, it wasn't discovered until people began to die of it in great numbers in the late 70s and early 80s. The blindness that characterized, the indifference, the depraved indifference that characterized the life, the political life of this planet in the aftermath of the assassination of John F. Kennedy is precisely the reason that the mindset that characterizes the creativity and the aggressive intelligence of Ludwig Beethoven is essential. Because in the case of Beethoven, he also was a Republican. He was a proud Republican. Now, of course, he wasn't a member of the Republican Party because, of course, the name of the Republican Party actually comes from an idea. Surprise, surprise. Hard to tell by the people that are in the Republican Party today. But the name came from an idea, and the idea was that the Republic and a Republican individual thought of themselves as having responsibility to come up with ideas to change the entirety of humanity and to fight for those ideas as a committee of one with that idea. And that democracies are often evil, like the democracy of a lynch mob. So democracy does not mean and does not equal goodness in government. That's merely it may be a defense for the right of everybody to speak up. But republicanism is the actual idea. And what that refers to is that it is the both right but responsibility, more important, to advance the most developed of ideas, but in the most beautiful way, the most force-free way. So tyranny and republicanism don't go together. Sometimes they do in the sense of the Republic of Venice or some particular society that calls itself a republic that misuses the term. But the idea is that the sovereignty of the human mind, the ability to uplift the mind and to present an idea of beauty and truth is the thing that Beethoven's compositions exemplify. It's not that other musicians didn't do it, other composers didn't do it, but it was a relentless pursuit in the case of Beethoven that was also identified with politics. This didn't mean because he wrote, quote, political compositions, though his opera Fidelio could be argued to be a political composition, but rather it's because of the struggle that's contained in his compositions, which is audible to the listener, and expresses an inter-resolution and drive to not simply, quote, succeed in the way that, one might talk about winning a race or something, but to transcend the difficulties and the borders and the limitations of any individual level or state of knowledge, to somehow break through and to pose problems in such a fashion that an audience can hear that as the subject of the music. Now that same idea is the only way, in the present circumstance that we find ourselves in tonight, to actually invent our way out of the present crisis. This is not a crisis of a particular system. This is not a crisis of particular countries. This is not a crisis of particular cultures, not in the normal sense. This is a crisis which is conjunctural. Everything is involved, and everybody in the planet is involved. Now, the fact that people may choose to ignore that just means they'll disappear, that they will find that they are morally unfit to survive. Nobody's going to have to condemn that to them. That's just going to happen to them. But those that try to pay attention and those that try to actually change these circumstances have to know how to think. Not what to think. That's dictatorship. But how to think. Now, that's what a Republican does. And so what we want to do here tonight is try to give an insight into why Lyndon LaRouche thought thinking like Beethoven was essential not only to everything he did as a thinker and as a political figure, and essential to every policy, every program, virtually every word he ever wrote on anything, but why that has to become something that you need to consider in your own thinking, because if you are able to do that, you'll be able to rise above the surveillance culture that has been intricately woven for you, in which you find yourself continually admired by your own axioms, to see a world which is also there simultaneously with that world, and it's one that you can access and you can think in such a fashion as to shatter that lower world, whether we're talking about the problems of finance and economics, whether we're talking about the problems of the danger of war, whether we're talking about the problem of cancel culture, or we're talking about the problems of dark age culture. All of these problems are accessible to solution, but it requires a higher order thinking, and it requires that we think about together, deliberate together, how to apply that in the present political circumstance. So to start us off this evening, we're going to start with David Shavin. David's done a lot of work. He's done a lot of work on many different things. He can say a bit about it. He's written about Mozart. He's written about Beethoven. And he does a lot of work with our intelligence sector, with Executive Intelligence Review. He's a practicing professional musician. And he will begin. He'll be followed by Fred Haight, also a composer, piano tuner, professional musician, one of our members for a long time. Then we'll open up for questions and discussion. Okay, so David.
Thanks for having me on for such a happy occasion as Beethoven's birthday. I love your title, President of the Human Mind. Let's hope we can live up to that. I'm going to take incidents of Beethoven's life between the ages of about 32 and 34 years old, where the Beethoven we know today was really formed. He was certainly talented. It could have been like many other talented musicians, but his case study goes into something rather terrifying, but how genius is actually formed and how political leadership is carried out, which was a tremendous, tremendous loneliness that he had to deal with, which he put on stage in the character of Leonora in his opera in 1804. We know it today as Fidelio, but its original name was Leonora. And I won't go into much of why this is based upon the Marquis de Lafayette and his wife, Adrienne, in particular. Just to say that, well, let's think about it, put him in perspective. Beethoven's 13 years old when the Treaty of Paris is signed at the conclusion of the American Revolution. And so in the 1780s, this has gotten people's attention throughout Europe. Doesn't mean they're all for it, doesn't mean they're all against it, but throughout Beethoven's teenage years, this is the leading issue. He is 22 when he finally gets to Vienna, and it's a very turbulent period. The French Revolution started in 1789, and for maybe a year or two, there was chances for Lafayette to gain the upper hand. But there's things like what you see today with gang counter gang, crazies on the right, crazies on the left, went on through that period, enough to demoralize almost anybody. So Beethoven throughout his 20s is in Vienna. It's a very reactive situation. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is one side of the gang, counter gang, and the crazies in France, cutting off people's heads, are the other side of it. So it looks like it's not clear there's a political way out of this thing. For somebody who actually wants the American Revolution idea put on the table, that heads of state could actually, even kings and queens could actually develop their population to a limited fashion, not just tax farm them or loot them or keep them in serfdom. They could actually, and this was the possible in Austria with Emperor Joseph throughout the 1780s, but this was cracked down on. Emperor Joseph died in 1790, 2 years before Beethoven got to Austria. So this is what Beethoven's dealing with throughout the 1790s, is they're literally imprisoning and executing the Republican constitutionalist who supported Emperor Joseph, but in the next emperor, we'll skip over Leopold, Emperor Franz, starting in 1792, they're eliminating the most rational, moral people. It's not a pretty situation. So it's Lafayette himself is put in prison in 1792, and he's there for 5 years. And his wife, Adrienne, is also put in prison by the French radicals. For them, she's too noble, and the German and Austrians who are against the French and being run by the British, the Marquis de Lafayette is too radical. The point is they were simply the high middle ground representing the American constitutional system. And I won't go into it now, but it's explicit that this is why the orders came from the British Crown and from Pitt, the Prime Minister, William Pitt, to make an example of Lafayette, to make sure that the gang, counter-gang operation could keep running because you're not allowed any other option. Beethoven did not give up on this. In 1798, he meets up with one of Lafayette's, what Monroe described as one of Lafayette's most intimate acquaintances, General Jean Bernadotte. He's the ambassador to Vienna from France in 1798. Beethoven, the biographers don't explain much of this at all, but he's a regular attendant at Bernadotte, excuse my pronunciation, Bernadotte, his place, his ambassador's residence in Vienna. It's said that Bernadotte gave Beethoven the idea of composing a symphony for Napoleon called the Napoleon Symphony. That's not proven, but I think the story will. You people can make their own judgment based upon hearing the connections. But the point is that Beethoven, throughout from 1798 to 1804, for 6 years, attaches his hopes to the French constitutional republicans around Lafayette, Bernadotte, and a couple of other people. They don't have the upper hand on Napoleon. They're trying to keep Napoleon in line with his promises. Napoleon was the guy with Carnot and others who put an end to all the chopping off of heads and tried to, keep France from being decimated. Anyhow, by 1804 is when Beethoven seriously gets started in writing the opera. But in 1798, he meets with both Bernadotte, who's close to Lafayette, and the violinist that Beethoven plays music with at Bernadette's place, Rudolf Kreutzer, known for the Kreutzer Sonata that Beethoven composed a sonata for him. Had in-depth discussions. Kreutzer is close friends with a fellow French Republican composer named Pierre Gaveau. Pierre Gaveau is the man who wrote the Leonora opera the original one in 1798, celebrating Lafayette's and Adrienne's release from captivity. The opera's put on stage in Paris a couple of months before, in the weeks before Beethoven's having these meetings with General Bernadette and Rudolf Kreutzer. I'll skip forward on this. So it's on Beethoven's mind throughout that period, and what we know today is the Eroica Symphony, the Third Symphony, is that symphony that he was working on. I'll just mention it. In May of 1804, Beethoven gets the news that Napoleon has given up on all the constitutional republicans. He's going to become an emperor. It's a famous story. Beethoven rips up the title page, which had been dedicated to Napoleon, rips it up, and in 1806, when it's finally published, he's renamed it the Eroica, and he says, to the memory of a great man. Let's get a little bit ahead of the story. So in 1802, when Beethoven's 32 years old, he hasn't done most of his famous works. He has a health crisis. He's losing his hearing. It's agonizing for him. He's a composer. I'll just read the famous Heiligenstadt Testament that he writes to his brothers in October of 1802. He says, born with an ardent and lively temperament, even susceptible to the diversions of society, I was compelled early to isolate myself, to live in loneliness. For me, there can be no recreations in society of my fellows, refined intercourse, mutual exchange of thought. Only just as little as the greatest needs command may I mix with society. I must live like an exile. He was no loner. He was a very sociable person. So going on, such incidents brought me to the verge of despair. But little more, and I would have put an end to my life. Only art it was that withheld me. It seemed impossible to leave the world until I had produced all that I felt called upon me to produce. And so I endured this wretched existence. Divine One, thou lookest into my inmost soul, thou knowest it, thou knowest that love of man and desire to do good live therein. So everybody has to figure out what their mission is in life, but Beethoven knew he had a greatness within him, and the world needed it, and he had to put up with this tremendous loneliness. He couldn't get bitter about his maker. This is contending the key to the Adrienne Lafayette story, and the woman, the character modeled upon Adrienne, Leonora, the lead character of the opera named after her. And what Beethoven takes the 1798 libretto, which had been done in Paris, and he has a friend of his, Sonnleitner, who's a political figure in Germany, in Vienna, put it into a German text. And it's at this time in 1803. Beethoven is so committed to these French, to getting the Eroica Symphony, at that time the Napoleon Symphony, into Paris, and to intervene on Napoleon, that he's announced that he's moving. He's going to leave Vienna for good. He's going to move at the age of 33 to Paris and work. We don't know all the people he was working with. I mentioned Bernadette, Lafayette, Carnot. These are the people who are trying to get Napoleon reined in. And it's like trying to work with, people can think about what's involved in trying to get the better part of Trump out of him, or even get Biden to grow a backbone and taking all the people trying to control him every time he tries to even breathe in the direction of Putin. So the key scene that Beethoven writes, which is not in the original libretto, Beethoven composes it brand new. It's called Mir ist so wunderbar. It's a quartet. It's based upon a canon where all four characters singing the same musical material. It goes on. You think all four characters are sort of on the same level, and too often this is how operas perform it. But this is agonizing torture for Leonora. She's basically trying to save her husband, who's been unfairly in prison. It's been 2 years. She has gone to a strange city. It's Seville, I think, and she don't know how to get into this massive prison. And she's dressed up as a man and trying to get a job as a jailer in the prison. And she's been successful, and she doesn't know how she's going to save her husband yet. And all of a sudden, the jailer Rocco has got a daughter who's and a boyfriend, and she's in love with Leonora. This time, Leonora dressed up as a man is called Fidelio, adopts that name, a man's name, and the quartet has Marceline, the jailer's daughter. Oh, I'm so in love. He loves me. I'm so happy, and the father, the Rocco, is saying, "Oh, they're such a wonderful couple. They're all going to be happy together." Giacchino, the jilted boyfriend, he's saying he's pretty upset. Nothing I can do. This is out of my control. So you just have this what otherwise would be a soap opera scene, and what Leonora is singing. Such danger. The rays of hope are weak. She loves me, it is clear. Nameless pain. Nomen losa pine. The nameless pain. And the opera goes from this agonizing situation that she's getting embroiled into a situation which she's got to figure out how to get around. It's just common people doing common things, and she has to present herself as being in that situation, but she knows in her mind she's got to do something historic. She's not a politician. She has to go beyond her destiny to carry out her mission. And she's the first, right at near the beginning of the opera, it's already pulling her down, and it's torturing her how she's going to be able to accomplish her mission. She's tremendously alone because all the social activity she can't participate in. And part of the opera is based upon going from Leonora's Nomen losa pine, nameless pain, to Nomen losa Freude at the end. And you just got to hear the music, how Beethoven sets that. But in a certain sense, it's very simple how to transform. The person who accepts a mission beyond what they think they can do, it takes some guts and some honesty to embrace that mission, not knowing how you're going to come out the other end. This is what Beethoven did with that Heiligenstadt Testament. This is what he did when he found out that his move to Paris, his decision in the summer of 1803 to move to Paris, not immediately, but over the next year and a half, but was wrapped up in getting the Eroica symphony into those circles. It was all destroyed by May of 1804. So it would have been nice if you had somebody you can hang your hat on and say, well, that guy's going to, if I get him educated and do the right thing, Western Europe, European civilization will go the way of the American Revolution. It won't be like it's been the last 200 years. But that was taken away from him. And he doesn't say rats. That was, had a good, he says, all right, I've got to dig deeper here. And what you have at this argument is that forget a man riding in on a white horse and saving you. Real Republican forms of government require every citizen to take on the mission as if they had to run the country themselves and be the president. That's why it's such a good title, President of the Human Mind, for Beethoven, because and he engages people on a certain level that Leonora was simply in love with her husband. She wasn't trying to make history. She wanted to save her husband. But in the process, she finds out she has to save all the prisoners. She has to save, even at a certain point, when she gets down to see the prisoner she can't identify as her husband necessarily, she's ready to save him regardless, because he's a poor, helpless man who evil is going after. Pizarro, named after William Pitt, is going after this poor man. So it turns out, what else to end this with? In it this way, there is a power of love, of a fundamental human emotion. It's not just teenagers falling in love. It's not just even people getting married. There actually is, when people are in that state, they think they can do anything. They can make history. They can, the creator of the universe has given them such a powerful force and such a powerful state of mind. And typically people in the humdrum of life, they don't know what happened to them when they fell in love, and that's end of story. But in fact, that since if people can fall in love, they can be a Republican leader. If they have the power to rise above chimpanzees and other species and actually concentrate over the long term and have deep fundamental emotions, they can do science. That's the concentration levels it takes to do science. It's the concentration levels it takes to think through 30 to 50-year plans for a society. And this is what Beethoven puts in this opera is a couple of hour dialogue over whether or not that feeling state you have of true love actually has a power to it, a power to transform the society. And I can't do all the music for you, but he does with the music. We talk with the words about it, the storyline, but the music actually accomplishes that work. One small example. A canon, what's genius about a canon? It's not that you have everybody singing the same thing and it sort of folds back upon itself because one voice. That's wonderful stuff about a canon. What is Beethoven, by having three characters on one level and one character on a tremendously different level, but they're singing the same melody lines, it promises there's a strange, not yet understood underlying bond between this potentially heroic person and these three decent people just not planning to accomplish anything important. And they found out by the end of the opera how that works out. But in the music, it's already suggested psychologically to an audience there is, despite how different she is and what she's singing, there's a reason they're bound together. And this is Beethoven's political. If there's not an easy, straightforward solution, and you're living in a world where most of your political leadership stinks to high heaven, doesn't excuse you. So that's Beethoven, the president of the human mind.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave. Okay, Fred?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Speak up a little bit more so we can check your volume.
Okay. All right. Thank you, David. That is very good, especially the way you put it, that around the years 1802 to 1804, he made a decision to become such a world historical human being. Because his music before that is great. It always has a kind of Promethean quality to it. But there's nothing like the Third Symphony or Fidelio. There's just nothing in history like it that's ever existed before. So I think it's very important that you identified that. I would like to identify another period of Beethoven, which is what is sometimes known as his late period. It's generally seen as beginning somewhere around 1815 to 1819. But what you have is after the defeat of Napoleon, you have the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which Beethoven has some hopes there from the Prussian delegation and others that something could be done. But it becomes pretty clear that a police state is being set up, a conservative order, to make sure that nothing like the American Revolution or the U.S. Constitution ever happens on European shores again. So that by 1819, you have the Carlsbad decree set in, which basically made a police state, censored the press, censored academics, and it also led to some very repressive measures, such as the 1819 massacre in Peterloo, England, which is what Shelley was addressing in his Mask of Anarchy. And the way that it works, that the police state works, is not like somebody comes up and points a gun at your head and says, "Don't think." But people get a sense that if you want to stay out of trouble, then perhaps you should not think too much, and you should perhaps not be too radical in what you're thinking. This is a period of what was known as lapsed classicism, where people who admired Beethoven and Schiller, who reached the heights, suddenly could not remember what they saw in those men, and lighter fare like Rossini became much more popular. But it was worse than that. It was known as the Biedermeier period. Poetry started becoming about nature. Furniture design was considered an art form. Interior decorating was considered an art form. People had a fair amount of money. And people just dumbed themselves down. They just banalized themselves. And it wasn't in a specific response to this order or that order. It's just when you're confronted with that type of situation, you can respond in different ways. And Beethoven's response is absolutely unprecedented because Beethoven was one of the most uncompromising spirits I've ever heard of, and that comes through in his music. If he had been a moral or political compromiser, you wouldn't hear the quality in his music that you do. But Beethoven decided, screw you to the oligarchy, and decided that he was going to develop his music and his thinking to a much higher level than had ever been done before. That's the music that is sometimes known as the late Beethoven, but it's not just musical. It is an entire approach to thought and to challenging. Beethoven challenges every axiom, and every time that you think you've got music figured out, he's unhappy, and he's going to throw something at you that says, well, you think you got it figured out, you don't have it figured out, and he throws a new challenge at you. So this led over that period to, I think, the greatest body of music ever composed. And it was a challenge not just to give in to the stupidity around you, but to respond to a dictatorship by developing your creative abilities to an even higher level than one would have thought possible. No one had a right to expect Beethoven to write the kind of music that he did in this time, because no one even knew it was possible for such music to be written. And Beethoven did see his music as educating mankind. He called his concerts academies, after Plato's Academy. And they were long. The same concert in 1825 that featured the Ninth Symphony also had 3 movements from the Missa Solemnis in it. He called them hymns. He had to call them hymns because it was not legal at that time to perform a mass outside of in a concert hall in Vienna. So that is Beethoven's. That's the way he fights, and he doesn't just fight by being, uncompromising, but he fights by developing the powers of mind and duty to a higher level than has ever existed before, and to a higher level than probably anybody has a right to expect. And in that he is a guide for us today, because people are just willingly dumbing themselves down. They don't have to sit there and watch all this stuff that Jacques Cheminade was talking about. They don't have to participate in that, but they are. And I think under these conditions, Dennis has it right. It's a crisis of civilization, a conjunctural crisis. Everybody's involved. Nobody gets away from it. And from that standpoint, when you look at how Beethoven reacted to such a set of circumstances around himself, then I think this has to be our model.
Okay, very good. What I'm going to do is open up the queue for questions, because I've already received a couple. I've already received a couple as text messages. And so we're going to be able to get started. There's also one thing in particular that I would like David Shavin to address. This has to do with somebody that was I was visiting with yesterday, actually, in part, who's working on the manual that the Schiller Institute wrote on tuning and registration. There's a note in an article by Lyndon LaRouche. This article is called Mozart's 1782 to 1786 Revolution in Music. Mozart's Revolution in Music. And he references there something about the violin. And since David is a violinist, we are asking him this question. And it relates to why Lynn insisted that music is primarily vocal and how that's seen in something like Beethoven's music. Now, the note talks about this. It says, the violin family of instruments. So we're talking about the violin, the viola, I guess also the cello, maybe even the double bass, string instruments. But the violin family of instruments was developed in order to imitate and then extend the principles of the bel canto singing voice. Each member of the violin family has 4 strings, with each string tuned at the musical interval of a fifth above or below the adjacent string or strings. The succeeding higher, in the simplest case, each open or unfingered string of the violin can be used as the lowest tone of a new surrogate vocal register, and that's in quotations. And so the issue here, so we don't get so technical about it, is what's meant by this idea that the music is all vocal. How is this reflected in instruments, and how is it that the instruments are extending the bel canto singing voice? And that's asked in order that when we get to things like the choral symphony or the choral fantasy, how the relationship of these things works.
Wow. I certainly do remember that article. It's I had an accompanying article on Mozart. The first major thing I ever wrote was in accompanied that one at the time. I mean, I think people just need to demystify some of the stuff. There were all sorts of string type of instruments up until the Renaissance, and they had twangy little sounds. The notable thing that happened in the generation of Da Vinci and just after Da Vinci with Raphael this is the early part of the 16th century, is you started getting from the violin family a real bel canto type of instrument, meaning the little middle section, you get an upper and lower chamber with a defined pinched-in area. So you get the aerodynamics of 2 chambers interacting. Like what bel canto singing does is with the head chamber and the chest chamber, you get something much better than either chamber separately when you start combining combining that. And Da Vinci did these experiments with horses' heads, and he was fascinated with how you got this lased quality of a sound, of a bel canto sound, which and it's sort of like a good example of the coincidence of opposites. You get you want to have a free, open sound, and you want to have it with structure and definition. So you get both. You get something that's tremendously free and tremendously structured. And so this was captured in the history of development of violins from the about 1520s, actually 1506 probably, up until the Amati, 4 generations of the Amati family, who lasted the 4 generations in the around 1660s or so, taught the young Stradivarius. These are the instruments that had this blazed bel canto quality to it. So the good thing about having LaRouche, Lynn would challenge people, stop thinking of these things as little entertainment devices. There's something lawful about the human voice. This is why I insisted upon the middle C being around 256 and being modeled on ways, taking his cue from Kepler, on the ways that the solar system was ordered and how the human hearing is ordered, how we think and hear harmonically. It's a longer issue, but Lynn provocatively put that forward. I remember sitting in a room with him the first time I heard him do that in New York back in '82 or '83, and he said, "Just put a violinist. I don't want to hear a violin playing unless you take him in the other room and beat the nonsense out of him till he, believes in physical reality, and then bring him in the room, let him play." What was the last part of your question? Is on the what we can develop.
Well, let's do this.
Develop in the instrumental world.
Yeah, I will return to that, but let me just say one thing, because several people have joined us since we began before, and they wouldn't necessarily know where we are in this discussion. So let me just explain why I entitled it "Beethoven, President of the Human Mind." We have had a couple of presidents in the case of the United States that could actually talk, but we haven't had one for a while. The last president that could sort of talk, basically, really, was Kennedy. We could argue about Ronald Reagan, and certainly the Challenger speech is something that should be noted. After that, nobody has been able to talk. Let me repeat that. After the Ronald Reagan Challenger speech, you have not heard a president speak English in the case of the United States. And that has been one of the primary reasons that it is impossible to unify the country, or seems to be impossible to unify the country. Now, it's however true that there are other Americans who were not president who were able to talk, and relatively recently. Martin Luther King being the example that always comes up. Malcolm X is another example that comes up. And there are other examples, perhaps controversial, that come up. Lyndon LaRouche was such a person. Actually, Louis Farrakhan is another such person. And what happens is that you can tell an American that can speak because of the number of people that try to shut him up. And also the things that are said against them, which never deal with the topic that they raise. Now, in the issue of music, just to say concerning this Beethoven issue, I'd like to point out something, and this gets now back to the last part of the question. In 1987, I had a conversation with Lyndon LaRouche I've sometimes told people about after that. We were there, and he wanted to have a 500-person group for the state of New Hampshire, where he was campaigning for the presidency. Now, Lyndon LaRouche had been indicted in June of '87, and this conversation was happening just before Labor Day. It was like 2 days before Labor Day. And what he said to me is, I want 500 people. That's what you need if you're really going to break through in New Hampshire. So I said, okay, I'll get on the phone and tell people to start getting people in here right away. He said, why are you going to do that? And I said, well, you just said you needed 500 people, so I thought I should. He said, yeah, but you can get all of those people here. Now, I had been in New Hampshire for a while, and I had severe doubts about the idea that you could just get those people from New Hampshire, because it was a very beaten-down population, poor, or very controlled. And what he said to me is, well, to deal with that problem, you have to form a chorus. That's how you can get the people. Now, I was as baffled as you probably are at hearing him say that. So, of course, I asked him the question, why are you saying to get the people that you want for your campaign, form a chorus? He said, because the problem with people that are oppressed and are feeling that they are alienated in politics, he said, is that they don't believe in the sound of their own voice. They actually can't, they don't believe that they are allowed to express ideas, and when they hear themselves beginning to do it, they get terrified by the sound of their own voice. He said, now, unless you put them together in a group, they will not have the sense of power. They will have the sense of being powerless. But if you put them together in a group and you teach them to sing, he said, then they will tell you their story, and then they will feel stronger. That's what he said. Now anybody that you don't have to accept what I just said. Certainly, I didn't just accept what I just said. We had to actually begin to do it. And then I was told by Graham Lowry, he's deceased now, he's an historian. He told me about what had happened in the American Revolution and how the Sons of Liberty, as organized by Sam Adams and some others, had unified the city of Boston, which was divided into a whole set of gangs in various of the wards of Boston, different sectors of the city. They unified the city by creating choruses. And then as they got that unity going, that sense of solidarity, then what they did was they would do their meetings against the British in churches where people would sing, and while they were singing, other people were meeting. So that the idea of the chorus, as that Lynn was putting forward to me, was actually a time-honored tradition that went back to before the American Revolution, for that matter, but primarily was something that Samuel Adams had organized. So that the relationship between music in America and politics, and I think the relationship between music and politics in many ways, is always of that variety. Now, of course, that's like completely unavailable to Americans as a result of the what I don't know what you even call it, the insipid nature of popular music today. That people don't perform music for themselves. People don't play instruments at home because they're, unless they may play a garage band, maybe something like that. But it's no longer the case that they hear the sound of their own voice. Maybe in church they do that. So there are exceptions. But the point of the thing that I just like to make about the question, and that second part was, how does this idea of singing work in the choral fantasy and the Ninth Symphony? Either one of you can answer that, but that was what it was, and so that was that question.
Fred, you want to chip in here?
Fred, if you're trying to talk, you're muted. Well, David, why don't you take it while we find out what until he gets back in. Maybe he'll just. I don't see him right now in the queue, so go ahead.
All right. I mean, Beethoven knew very well the problems of setting poetry to music, and took it quite seriously in terms of having to internalize every feature of how the poem worked, and to bring something totally new from the musical world, the power of the complex domain of music, to get at the heart of how the poem worked the way it did. So, Ninth Symphony, as Fred put it earlier, nobody expected him to do something like that. You have a dialogue at the beginning of the last movement where you self-consciously address the first three movements. After that third movement, it's sublime. How would anybody ever question that? That it's not enough. What could you possibly do beyond that? So it really is a sense of theater and drama, unlike, as the fourth movement opens up, they have the elements, the references from the earlier movements, until you find, and you just look over Beethoven's shoulder as the suggestion of how comes up, and for some reason that's the magical solution, and you grip to hear the rest of the development of that to see why that's the appropriate solution. The voice that comes in, it's not just saying all those instruments you just heard, which are great human inventions based upon the voice, and look how it's a matter of integrating back from where people's soul and their capacity to produce ideas which inform the voice, which allow you to speak English like a rare president. It's the lawful place to go back to. It's not a matter of saying, I like instruments better than voices, I like voices better than instruments. The capacity to extend the human voice. I once had this discussion with Lynn about some of the interesting questions he had on this thing. I said, well, you can have natural rivers where they are, and you don't want to violate that stupidly, but you make intelligent decisions in a civilization on how to build canals and how to reform what you got, and that's not dissing, rivers. But it was always a question of in art of how you intervene upon nature. And Beethoven did this with coming back to use the power of music to get people to hear the poetry, hear the powers of their own soul in a way they could not do it some other way. And both with what Fred was pointing to on the Missa Solemnis of 1824 or so, and the Ninth Symphony of pretty much the same period, these things, after 9 or 10 years of Beethoven, you can say thrown back on his heels, but he didn't really have a public stage. He didn't let that stop him. He just came in, outflanked the oligarchs of that period, and just put these you call them vocal, instrumental. It's not one or the other. You put these new creations in the world and left people to try to figure out what just happened to them, and maybe that power is it somehow touches them too. I'll leave it at that.
Okay,
can you
fine.
Hear me,
now we can hear you.
Can you
go
hear
ahead.
Me? Am I on?
Go ahead. Yes.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. I just, in addressing this, I just wanted to bring up something a little bit different. I've been looking recently at the Renaissance, the 15th century, and choruses was one of the main organizing tools that was used to educate and uplift the people. They developed in a small area of the Netherlands, the southern Netherlands, but soon major composers from that area were all over Italy, in every city and every church, and the people were getting involved in singing, and in singing new compositions, which were very challenging towards them. Erasmus of Rotterdam was involved with the Brotherhood of the Common Life in the Netherlands, but he was also involved in the choruses. He sang in the chorus of Jacob Obrecht, and he took a keen interest in the development of choruses wherever he went. He distinguished between what he called Dionysian choruses, which had some very bad practices, and those which were actually following the right course. And for him, getting your voice in tune was part of getting your life in tune. That was the more the deeper aspect of it. He wrote a beautiful epitaph for Johannes Ockeghem, who was the most famous composer at the time. Ockeghem went to France and ran Louis XI's music program for him, so that boys participated in choruses from all over France as a means of going on to higher education. And in this poem, he refers to the golden voice of Ockeghem, that this voice has been lost, suggesting that the composer himself was not just a composer of vocal music, but a great singer. And of course that makes sense, because they weren't learning music from the pianos in those days. They weren't that, the keyboards and other instruments weren't that advanced. They were learning it from singing. So you joined a chorus, you studied music, you became a composer, but the best composers were also the best singers, just as later the best composers were the best pianists. And I think there's a lot more to be looked at from that. Certainly the question of Leonardo's work on the voice and how that would have affected this whole entire choral tradition is something. And Dennis, you mentioned this in the United States. It was all over the place. I live about 45 kilometers from a town called Kitchener, which used to be known as Berlin. Unfortunately, when World War I broke out, they got rather violent and changed the name. But it's a very heavily German city. They used to have a festival called Concordantia every year, and choruses would arrive by train from all over Canada and the United States, and they would sing major works like Mozart masses, Mendelssohn's Elijah, Haydn's Creation, and works like that. And it was a big cultural conclave where, as you said, people got together and they were doing other things at the same time. We don't have that anymore. We have Oktoberfest instead. And then one last thing on this question of the string instruments that David was talking about. David knows well, he's written about this, but there was a real crash program towards the end of the 1600s to advance music. Bach was part of it in northern Germany, but in Italy you had the Salon of the Medici in Florence, the last of the Medici family. They sponsored Stradivarius and commissioned him to make new instruments. They also sponsored Corelli to write music for it that would put the new instruments through their paces. At the same time, the very same time, they sponsored Cristofori, who developed the very first pianoforte, and that was designed to create a keyboard that was more like the human voice. And they had a composer named Giustini, who also his mission was to compose for this new instrument. So at the same time, opera was being advanced. So, and at the same time, they were studying Kepler. I'd seen it. They were actually studying the works of Kepler in this, and circles around Bach were seen at the same time. So you had a real concerted drive to actually force a breakthrough in music around some of these ideas and the creation of new instruments. And there's one thing that I just have to point out, which is that there's been such suppression of this stuff for centuries that you take the period of really great music, starting from around the time of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier through the death of Brahms. And out of the thousands of years that human beings have been around and that music has been around, we're talking about 200 years. That's about it. We have a narrow accomplishment of 200 years of some of the most sublime music the world has ever seen, and Beethoven is the height of it. And we all know some of the things that happened in the 20th century to destroy it. But that is a precious legacy of mankind, and a very small one, and we have to fan the flames and revive it with everything that we can. So that's just what I wanted to add to it.
Okay, we're going to go to the phones. We have somebody there. We have a few people there, and we have also these couple of questions, which I'll direct to you guys in just a minute that we got at the beginning with the text questions. Yeah. Okay, are you able to hear us?
Hi, Dennis, David,
yes.
Craig. Good evening. A lot to unpack there. Probably just answer my question with the first question you asked, but I'll ask anyway. One challenge that I come up with and implementing classical culture is freaking important. It hasn't been there for a while, not since I went to college back in like 2007, 2008, and it just slowly just leaked out since then. What I get it. It's unrealistic for me to think that, okay, I carry somebody to see a Beethoven or a Bach or Brahms concert or a symphony, and expect them to come out automatically Lyndon LaRouche start classical ideas. Well, of course not. But what should be the for lack of a better wording, what's the measure of effect that I should look for in my age group, and particularly the youth, to see that at least some parts. I get, and the first part is getting away from this rotten hip hop and R&B and all this trash and that. This horrific music going on nowadays. That's step number one, important. But what should be the measure of effect that says that hey, they're on their way to changing their methods of thinking and so on. Because I can imagine it. If Beethoven had a hard time doing it, then man, I don't want to introduce it and then he does nothing. Cause that'd be frustrating. So what would and I'm not trying to get a guaranteed result. I don't expect that. But what should I look for in changes in mindset and eventually actions, if at all possible? Your guys' thoughts?
Well, I would not drag them to a concert. I mean, I get paid money to play concerts, but drag them to a chorus. Drag them to a political meeting that we have. I mean, the point what Dennis was saying before, it is a quality of organization of the mind which doesn't happen most of the time. You can pose it as a paradox, you can pose it as a joke, and people say, hold it, this person thinks differently than what I'm used to. I don't care whether I agree with them or not. You pose a certain quality. All classical culture really means, as far as I'm concerned, is the Creator made the universe lawfully. So for Kepler, it means what you see out there in the stars and the heavens and the solar system has a strange poetic call to allow you to identify things going on in your insides. It's a unique instrument. It's like a little mobile above a baby's crib. You have something to actually externalize and address lawful procedures and powers you have within you. And anything that summons that up will get people involved in classical culture. If they find out that, you can't fake it. If that's not your experience at classical concert, don't drag them there. If you get that experience at a political meeting, at a poetry reading, at whatever, there's what we're doing in intervening politically in Republican as a real potent Republican outfit with the classical culture is not an artificial thing where you get people to applaud, when the symphony is finally over. So I would just you think much broader about what kind of invasive techniques you have. All your friends are suffering. They're seeing COVID. They're seeing life being changed. If they probably have got some idea that the United States has been bombing a lot of places the last 20, 30 years. It's not a mystery. Anything that simply says that is stinking and wrong, there's another way out of this mess, is the beginning of it. Any paradox about Christmas and people wanting to have peace versus what's happening is a lawful classical composition. It's all over the place.
Brett?
And there are institutions. There is the Schiller Institute. There is the Schiller Institute Chorus. Join it. Get your friends to join it. You're not alone, just, one person trying to suddenly make a change in everybody around you. These institutions exist. There's the LaRouche organization. And there's regular news posted there that you can go to, so you don't have to depend on CNN. So that's what I would say is take the plunge. And one thing about our choruses, the Republican choruses, I remember being at an alto sectional once where a professional opera singer took about 15 minutes and worked with the different women in the alto section. And she was so good that within that short period of time, everybody improved. Everybody's voice improved. Everybody's knowledge improved. And there was a real feeling of equality that we didn't want to leave anybody behind. And that, we were pulling people all together to do something. And they all felt like part of it. Whereas professional courses, you apply and you better be highly trained, and if you're not, you're out in a minute. So what our courses do in terms of organizing the people is something different than you're going to get with most of the paid professional courses. So that's our answer to you.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I would just also add something. Let me just add something because this is the easiest thing that you can do. So everybody who claims this is hard to do, please. You know, we, in 1973, long time ago, there was a gang called the Outlaws. This is during a rather dangerous period in New York. And we had this gang. We were trying to organize something called the Revolutionary Youth Movement. And we became infamous for taking members of this gang up to Columbia University for a class that was given by a woman who was at that time a member. Her name was Christine Burrell, and she gave a class on a Ludwig Beethoven piano sonata, the Opus 106, the Hammerklavier. The whole class was about the slow movement of this sonata. Now, here was the challenge. I mean, these are people who were often armed. We dissuaded that in general, but you never quite exactly knew, right? And there were some of the people at the campus were a little concerned, but they were also terrified, so they didn't try to stop these classes. And that class had real tension. Why? Because the musician had to get across a very advanced idea without dumbing it down to a group of people who had no experience of this whatsoever and, frankly, could have been disinclined not to like it. That is real education. And that is what is missing in today's United States, period, in everything. So-called political discussion, political discourse, all of it. Pretty cowardly, actually. You know, people beating each other up on the internet because that's easy. But actually discussing through an idea such that the idea is intended to change the inside of the mind of the other person, that's something different. And I would just say this, you have to start with yourself. You have to find something that moves you, and then you go from there forward. But you can't do it unless you're moved by it yourself. If it's your view that this really is irrelevant to me because you haven't been gripped by something that has meant something to you, then you can't convey anything about this. It's impossible. See, so that's the way it is, right? And should be. That's the way it should be. No fraud, no dissembling, no subterfuge, no advertising, right? The real thing, the real confrontation, and that's what you need to do, and it'll work. Okay, so here's what we'll do. But thanks for the question because it helped a lot of people, I'm sure.
Yeah, right. Definitely helped me. I appreciate it.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Great, very good. Okay, I'm going to go now to a. This is from one of the organizers, Kynan. He was in the office all day doing things. So I want to just reference this. He says, here's what I wanted to ask regarding Beethoven. I find that a lot of people, whether they are just everyday listeners of Beethoven or experts on his work, that they write off Beethoven's genius as something of an aberration. They claim that there is no explicable reason for why Beethoven was such a great genius and wrote such monumental works, that he was merely just born that way, along with his contemporaries like Mozart and Schubert. Is it true that genius simply emerges out of nowhere? How is it that Beethoven was able to create such beautiful works? Where did his genius come from? That's the question.
Okay. Can I answer that, David?
Go for it. You may. Okay. You can. I don't know.
Yes. Right. Another question. Look, I know this idea of Beethoven, a titan wrestling with the gods, which was actually Wagner's term. Wagner invented that and was one of the people who went a long way to promote this false notion of a genius. A genius that comes along once a century. We can't account for him. We don't know where it comes from. and we certainly can't recreate it. And it was very interesting to me to look at Beethoven's childhood in Bonn. Joseph II, the emperor, was a close patron of Mozart, and his brother Max Franz, his younger brother, also supported Mozart. But he wanted to do the same thing in Bonn. He wanted to make it a real cultural center. So he did a number of things. He took the court theater and made it into a public theater. That court theater performed regularly German translations of Shakespeare. They performed Schiller. They actually did a couple of world premieres of Schiller. Beethoven grew up with that. They had a Lesengesellschaft. Most of the youth were involved in a reading society where they would sit down and discuss. And there were no class differences in the reading society. They would sit down and read the most difficult modern works and works of antiquity. And Beethoven once commented that there's scarcely a work that is too difficult for me to understand. The Max Franz created an orchestra, and Beethoven played, I think, viola in the orchestra. It was a youth orchestra, but the intention of it was to have a cauldron, to literally reach a boiling point where great musicians, including composers, would be generated out of the culture that they were building there. There were at least, I think, 5 different composers who came out of that orchestra: Anton Reicher, the Romberg brothers, and of course one great one, Beethoven. So not only did he not come out of nowhere, he was part of a conscious project to create a degree of intensity of culture and study that great minds and great composers and great musicians would come out of it. And that's precisely what happened. So it's something that is very intelligible and is replicable. And the whole idea that he's some kind of unknowable genius is a deliberate romantic lie spread to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
I just add
anything?
Sure. And there's something to this, not so disingenuous about this lie. It's a frequently thing said. It goes back to Kant. You know, we can't account for these things. They're just geniuses. They come, they go. But same question about a scientific invention, about Einstein's work. If you love humanity and you think humanity, there's something, a wealth and a richness in the world that humanity's not yet mastered, and it may be important, and it will enrich people. It will make them better people. It will keep them from disasters. Then you simply fight the concept. You wrap your identity around that. People don't want to talk about that, but it's because they don't want to say that you're supposed to have a mission in life. You're born. When you figure out you're going to die, you're supposed to, figure out how much entertainment you can cram into yourself before the game's over. And that's not. You can't understand anything about genius in that type of world. It takes, and Lynn was very clear about this. You think there's something important for the human race that's got to be accomplished. It has not been accomplished before. Maybe something like it's been accomplished, and you either walk away from it or you wrap your identity around it, and you consider that you have a passion to change history for the better. That's how genius works. It's a lot of hard work.
I'll point out just one thing as before we go back to, we have some people in the queue, just to say, Xi Jinping of China is leading a nation of 1.4 billion people. When he speaks, he has to be accountable to a number of persons that were equivalent to about what the human race was at the turn of, about the year 1900, roughly. So then what is required is to somehow state something that's actually going to move those people to some sort of course of action that is dedicated for the future. Now, persons want to say, well, he's a communist. The question is, what is he saying that is creating a circumstance or contributing to the creation of a circumstance where that nation is turning out more classically trained musicians in Western classical music in the music of Bach and Mozart and so on than anywhere else in the whole world. Now, I'm not attributing that to Xi Jinping. I'm saying, what is he doing and what is that government doing such that that result is occurring? What's that process? Now, in order to be able to approach that process, you would probably have to disabuse yourself of many different assumptions. For example, one of them is that China is communist, just because it says it is. It says there's a giant communist party. Is that what it is? Is China Marxist? And if so, why does its economy work? I would submit that it is not, in fact, a Marxist state, because if it were, its economy wouldn't work. Now, I'm pointing this out merely for the purpose of getting at this issue of what people really mean, if they actually mean anything. When they ask questions, I'm not attacking the question at all, but I'm pointing something out about the idea of music. Music is not an art form involving particular instruments and sound. There's a different conception of music, and I'm not going to attempt to make a positivist, assertion about what it is. I want to point out what it isn't. And that when Lyndon LaRouche said to me, people haven't been able to hear their own voices, what did he mean? What did he mean by the idea of they're acting as a chorus? He didn't say act as a party. He didn't say form a political party, form a political faction. Yet he's trying to get elected president. He wants these people working for his presidential campaign. So what was he doing? What was he trying to get at? What was the conception he meant? And I think if that becomes the subject of how one approaches this idea, then some of the mysticism that seems to be the subject will evaporate. Because we've got a circumstance that we're confronted with right now in the world where there is no clear voice in America, with the exception of ours, that we have been able to locate. We are in a desperate search for signs of intelligent life in the United States and much of the transatlantic world. Okay? So this is part of what the function is of what we're talking about. I just wanted to make sure that was stated, and we return to the call to the phones now. Okay. Are you able to hear us?
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hi. This is Renee. Well, I'd like to add something to the answer to Kynan's question, if I may, which is that my own hypothesis about this. Oh, excuse me. I hope I didn't. I just bumped into a number on my phone.
No, we can hear you.
Okay. My own hypothesis about this over a long period of time is that we'll have a better understanding of. I want to just say what it is, and then just draw a further conclusion from it, or further implication of it. But I think we'll have a better understanding when somebody has the time and the situation where they can look into Beethoven's relationship to his dear friend, who was a little bit older than him, this rather remarkable teacher that he had when he was in Bonn by the name of Nefe. It's very difficult to find out about him, but I personally have no doubt that he had an enormous role in helping this child who had been working under rather difficult circumstances. Beethoven was already employed when he was 8 years old in doing this music work to help to keep the family alive. As much as the local aristocracy might wanted to be enlightened, I think they were kind of a little bit rough on some of the kids. But he was in a very difficult situation, and this young man turned up in Bonn who had been a cantor at the St. Thomas Schule in Leipzig. He had been a cantor after Bach had died, and was actually one of the students who was raised by Bach. And it's not really clear why he left Leipzig and went to Bonn. This is not documented anywhere. and he needed a job. And the Beethoven family not only hired him to give Beethoven piano lessons as a child, but they were sharing jobs because this guy desperately needed some money. So little Beethoven used to say to him, "Well, you can play in the church on Sunday instead of me because I can get some sleep." But this guy was kind of remarkable, and he is the person who did for the young Beethoven what had earlier happened to Mozart under different circumstances, which was he introduced him to Bach's compositions, which were the well-tempered, he is the person who is alleged to have made it possible for this child to master the 2 volumes of the Well-Tempered Clavier by the time he was 11 years old. I mean, there are some people now who are in books that they're writing who are challenging the accuracy of the report that when they went to Vienna together when Beethoven was 11 and went specifically to meet Mozart, that it was when Beethoven sat down and started playing the Well-Tempered Clavier for Mozart that Mozart looked up and said, "This child is really exceptional. Keep an eye on him," because parents were always bringing their children to Mozart and saying, "What do you think of my kid?" And Mozart's patience was a little bit worn out by this, but he was really very moved by this. Now, I think this story about, and also Nefe was a Platonic scholar. According to the little I've been able to find out about him, he had studied Plato, and they did talk about Plato and so forth. Is that you, David, who wanted to say something? Did I hear you?
No, that was me. Nefe was also the head of the Lesegesellschaft, the Reading Society. So
okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult to get any information about him, which to me tips. I think this is something that has to be done in Germany. But I want to make a broader point, which is I think it's also important for Americans to understand that in the period that parallel to the same period in which Benjamin Franklin, starting in the early 1720s, was already organizing around Leibniz's ideas for a revolutionary transformation in the colonies. That parallel to that, there was an explosion of a Renaissance in Germany, which in general is really not well understood because of the culture that we're living in today. I mean, we've really been fighting with people to understand Schiller, who's a little bit older than Beethoven. He's a contemporary, but he's a little bit older. So therefore, Beethoven had the support of Schiller's writings under these terrible circumstances, by the time he was 20 years old and so forth, or 25 years old, that Schiller's writings were recognized by the people in the circles that he was in. But there were a number of great geniuses who emerged in that period in Germany. And it wasn't accidental. It really was a result of the combined influence of the ideas of Leibniz representing Kepler, the popularity of Kepler in many parts of Germany. And this is reflected in the way that Beethoven's compositions worked. I think that one of the things that Lynn, certainly in the formative period of the organization, really emphasized a lot was that one of the most remarkable things about Beethoven, which is very similar to Kepler, is that he's one of the great figures in history with whom you can actually document successively the occurrence of creative breakthroughs. That you can take almost any sequence of compositions, 3 compositions, 5 compositions, 8 compositions, or 2 compositions that you compare in Beethoven's lifetime, and that you will be able to see a breakthrough in a comprehension of the implications of musical counterpoint. And of course, the other point that Lynn always emphasized about Beethoven was the much more aggressive way that he drew the mind to the transitions between musical material. I mean, which is something that I think even people who don't have a very deep musical background, if it's pointed out to them, can begin to experience, especially if they if they listen to a decent recording or go to a decent performance. I mean, one of the problems we have today is a lot of the performances are aimed at evening this out, flattening it out, getting rid of this, so that people get kind of irritated with classical music because it seems kind of dead. And you can hear a lot of dead performances over the radio. You've really got to go looking for the ones that are not dead, what are not just the stream of notes being thrown at you, but that in the better performances, you can actually draw the attention in Beethoven to the prominence of the transitions between ideas, which Lynn would draw attention to. So you have the two things, the constant revolution in the treatment of the musical configurations, but then also the transitions between the different material in a given composition on how this is transformed in the course of the composition. The rate of change is much more rapid than anybody who came before. But his doing that is very consistent with the kind of scientific breakthroughs that were being made at that time. The things that Gauss and Riemann were looking at. It's an amazing parallel when you actually think about the overlay of the kinds of discoveries that Beethoven made in music, and the way they seem to be mirrored in the scientific discoveries that are made. So I just wanted to highlight that aspect to it, because I think one of the reasons so many silly things are said about this is that ever since World War II, there really is an orchestrated intention to de-emphasize that there really was a Renaissance in Germany in that period. It was partly reflected in some other countries in Europe, but it was strongest in Germany. And you're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to know that. And that's why so many of the truly greatest musical composers were German. I think some of the composition, by the way, this is not to argue with you, Fred, but I think some of the compositions in the 200 years before are also quite remarkable and made Bach possible.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, it really does. It was the development of music in Europe was an unbroken legacy from the earlier Renaissance, and it kind of never went away, even though there was repeated attempts to crush it. But it was always kind of hanging out there. But it exploded in Germany, and there's a unity of principle in the ideas of Leibniz and the way that expresses itself, which was a very powerful force in German culture. And you're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to know that, and that's part of the, that's part of the confusion. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Good. I think actually that may make for another topic on actually for one of the shows we do, because we should also actually resurrect our original work on Moses Mendelssohn, which was really the original work, right? And how that Renaissance in Germany happened and why it's denied.
And of course, and as David pointed out, that's why today we have access to Bach's music, because even after Mozart and Haydn discovered it and introduced it into their compositions, there was a real effort to crush, to wipe Bach out of visibility. And
yeah, right.
It was because, right.
We could do a program on the Jewish roots of the German Renaissance. That'll be good.
You got it.
All right. Very good. Thanks a lot. Okay. Yes, are you able to hear us?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is Dayton in Houston. Very interesting discussion and many points of enlightenment here. I have been telling friends lately that I think our country's in such deep doo-doo because we've lost our grasp of the culture that brought us. Of course, I see the heart of that culture as being what the lady just now was talking about, the high German thinking. And I think that we were experiencing a great entropy concerning culture. It's being displaced by something very commercial, and of course we know that no one ever went broke underestimating taste. There's a word that I've been wanting to hear more of. Dennis, you actually used it in a form, and that is the word beauty. Because I think the quest for beauty, the spiritual transaction of the quest for beauty, is what we're talking about in the arts. And the arts need to be seen as integrated and convertible from one to the other. You look at Wagner, for instance, in his Gesamtkunstwerk, where the various arts, theatrical, graphical, musical, whatever, all work together to produce the overall effect. There's great beauty in that. But concerning Wagner, the comment was made about the somewhat heroic nature of that. I think that the ego would probably agree with that. But I look at Strauss and Ein Heldenleben, because that's really a topical allusion to his own life, the quotidian quest to make art, going out daily to the labor of making art, etc. But anyway, where all this leads is kind of interesting to me, because it's at the heart of things. It's at the heart of, shall we say, our hearts and our minds, of our intellect and our emotion, and the disintegration, the disconnection of those two for useful purposes, economic, political, and otherwise. And I think that music is the one thing that integrates it. And I direct a chorus in a German club here in Houston, and I've been telling my people, asking the question, why do we sing? I say we sing because we have to. If we didn't sing, we'd explode, because the very substance of music is emotion, and singing is the way to lay our life on the air and communicate it to ourselves as well, because when we speak to ourselves, when we sing to ourselves and to others, we also hear ourselves, and there's a great joy in that. And harmony is not the absence of tensions; it's the resolution of tensions. So concepts of order, even going back to physics and the physical order, back to the Greeks, and dividing strings and creating scales and all of that. This relates to that. I think we have to start seeing the universe as a more integrated thing. All things are interrelated, in my view. And of course, it all leads to that one great thing, and that's nature. Well, what is the signature of nature but beauty? And so the quest for beauty, I think, is central. And that quest, as we might have seen in the Romantic movement, and particularly the periods we've been concerned with here with Beethoven and Schubert and Brahms and all that, is really kind of embargoed today because it's inconvenient economically. It's hard to market that. It's easier to market Madonna or some other cacophonic, toxic quantity than it is to market good orchestral performances, or most especially Lieder. My gosh, Lieder is something that hardly anyone will listen to today, but what beauty exists in Lieder, in ideas, and of course in the pure music itself. But I would say that nature is where all the direction in which we'll find these things, and I think it used to be taught more in education. And of course, today I really wonder. My piano teacher wrote a book on piano technique many years ago, and she discovered something in her research, a very interesting statistic. This would have been in the late 60s or mid 60s, and she said that she found that less than 1% of all persons in penal institutions, that is in prisons, had any kind of musical training whatever. I think a very revealing statistic, and has a lot to say about behavior and order in society, I would think. Concerning the term genius, and of course that is inseparable from the figures in music that we talked about here, Einstein didn't like the term genius, and he denied that he was a genius. He said he was only relentlessly curious. So that leads us once again to the term quest, and I say it's the quest for beauty.
Okay, let them respond. Let's get some response to what you said.
I will conclude with one thought. May I conclude with one brief thought?
Sure, go ahead.
I was going to give you something brief, and I think it comes from Goethe. And Orpheus, of course, the shall we say, the god, a demigod of music, and this little poem is very simple. It says, "Wann Orpheus sang, kamen die Tiere in der Erde, kamen die Vögel in der Luft, und kamen die Fische in Wasser und lauschten." The animals of the earth came, the birds of the air came, the fish of the sea came, and they listened. It's nature.
Well, my response on that one is somewhat different. Go for Keats on beauty is truth. Truth, beauty.
That's a short way. Yes, that's all you know.
The point there is that beauty is not simply to be overwhelm us. What I was saying before about the classical principle excludes a lot of things. The classical principle in a Beethoven symphony, bum 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 bum, that shape of an idea has to. You can't just say that. You can't just do that without a challenge that the whole work will develop the shape of that idea. Certainly is a unity to that. So that in what's in the small and what's the universal has a fundamental link, maybe not realizable immediately, and it takes a dialogue process to work that out. So beauty is truth, beauty, not obviously. Fundamentally it is, but beauty leads us to the truth. And people have to, when they experience something beautiful, it's not just to be enjoyed. It should be enjoyed, but it should impel them to say, there's something about this universe I don't understand. There's something about my inner emotions and my internal state that I have not come to full grasp of. There's something that overwhelms me, brings me tears of joy. Why does that happen? And you have to be so in these struggle for genius. It's always a matter of saying, it can be provoked by like with Moses Mendelssohn and Lessing and these others that what was horrible being done to Leibniz. It could be done today by what was horrible done to LaRouche. People can take these challenges instead of just crying about it. They can sit there and say, "There's something. This is a measure. There's something fundamentally wrong here," and fight to get to the truth. And the way the universe is composed, the way the solar system is composed, has a very fundamental connection to how our hearing is composed. And that's classical. What people think is objective out there and what they think is unknowable and subjective in their own internal processes is just not the case. So that's we've got to let beauty be, when we haven't mastered truth and we're a little bit lost on our way, we let beauty affect us and discover something about us that's been keeping us, that we haven't been accessing and therefore haven't been able to realize the truth yet. So it's not, I guess I'm reacting to, beauty is not simply nature. And that's certainly not the way Mozart treated, these composers treated Lieds, treated symphonies, treated all their compositions. Even the ones that sound like it. I'll finish it. I'll pop in.
It's when we perceive beauty, we might not entirely understand it, and there's no need to analyze it necessarily. It has an effect on us, but that is the lodestone of our direction. What is substituted for that today? Instead of beauty, people have been pushed into accepting complexity and confusion, the inscrutable, the incomprehensible, cacophony, basically, in place of harmonic music. Well, whatever. I may be giving myself a headache. I'm sorry.
I'm saying, let's also see if Fred has anything to say. Fred?
I didn't hear you.
Yeah, I think David is making a very important point about the beauty of the universe and seeing that and the beauty of the human mind with it. Because otherwise, look what happened in the 20th century. I mean, everything was considered legitimate. And Wagner, I'm sorry to say this, Wagner led the way. I mean, I think the problem with the Romantic movement and Wagner and Liszt is one of the big things that we have not really dealt with. And all of the atonal composers and serial composers of the 20th century saw Wagner as the man who led the way for them with his disintegration into a chromatic harmony. And that ended up being ugly. the 20th century was a great massive ugliness in music and art in every form. And these romantics paved the way from it. So therefore, you have to be, I think, a little more judicious in terms of what you're actually terming beauty. And Wagner was also one of the people who really tried to kill Beethoven, kill him with praise. He called him the master. I love him, blah, blah, blah. But Wagner was the guy who said, well, there's no use trying to write a symphony. There's no use trying to write a sonata. It's just Beethoven has said everything there is to be said, and therefore the only way to go is music drama, which conveniently meant he did not have to be compared to Beethoven. But even people like Schumann were influenced by this. One of the things that really moved Robert Schumann when he first met Brahms, a 23-year-old kid, or 20-year-old kid, sorry, is he walked in there and he plays Piano Sonata No. 1, which starts out with a direct quote from the opening of Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata. So at a time when Wagner is running around saying there's no use even trying to write a sonata, Brahms is stepping in there and saying, I'm going to do it. And Schumann was inspired by it. So I think that the whole idea that the Romantics is considered part of classical music is a weak point, which has participated massively in the slide downhill of classical art.
Well, I think I want to just say something here. Hold on, I want to say something here that so that the audience that's hearing this gets an idea about something. In fact, in this discussion, in this issue of Beethoven and Wagner, is the centerpiece, the seed crystal of everything that goes wrong in the late 19th and early 20th century. Mm-hmm. It is not Marxism, which was actually, although it's pernicious, would ultimately fail, but it is this, which is highly elusive, which is the seed crystal, and understanding what it is we're trying to get at here. Wagner's short story, A Visit to Beethoven, is relevant here. Rather than going to the artwork of the future and some of the other writings, which are a little easier, everybody will object to, what Wagner says in things like on Judaism and music and all. It's easy to say something to show that Wagner is a problematic guy. But then what everybody says is, but when you listen to the music, Zubin Mehta says that. All sorts of people say that. Whether they're Jewish or not Jewish, they say that. So this is an interesting and important topic, because if you take for people that don't exactly know what we're referring to here, Wagner was ostensibly also a political revolutionist. He was on the barricades in 1848, literally, with, Bakunin and other bomb throwers. He certainly was, of all of the people called classical musicians, or mistakenly called classical musicians, however you want to think about it, other than maybe Verdi in a different way, the most explicitly political in that sense. So he wasn't. But I'm bringing this up because Leonard Bernstein will talk about this, and you have all sorts of very, very important matters here. And there's a piece that we aren't going to say much about here, but it's the Love, Death, Le Liebestod of Wagner.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's the one that is the there are many things about Wagner, but that one, and challenging people on that's the issue here is Beethoven as the president of the human mind. And all I want to say here to people, and because this goes beyond the possibilities of tonight's discussion, but we've certainly gotten a lot of ideas about the directions of discussion. I'm very glad you called, particularly you're running a course there in Texas. And having these conversations among the musicians is very important to us for the following reason. The way we are going to reconstitute non-toxic politics in the United States will be based on musicians, including vocalists and as well as instrumentalists, and choruses. We will be able to do it because in this realm, it's possible to identify what we mean by beauty. It's possible to replicate it. It's also possible for people and necessary for people to hear, not merely mistakes that they make, but the idea of tuning that we talk about, which is not actually based on nature. I mean, it's based on nature, but it goes beyond it. The notion of tuning we're talking about is not something that you can arrive at mathematically or statistically or even geometrically. It's a physical expression, but it's really an expression of human ideas. Yeah. And the idea of getting a chorus, which has a transparency that sometimes even in non-classical forms, people know what that is. They talk about that in a cappella groups about how they were sounded sharp, as they say, not sharp as in higher tone, but they were transparent. They were tight. It's the term tight. And the idea that somehow they were able to tune the voices. People think, well, their voices were really compatible. Yeah, but what does that really mean? These are matters that are at the very core of our whole politics today, because everybody knows the politics is ugly. It's cacophonous, as you said. I think you said it's distorted. It's brutal on the ear. Why? Why does it sound like that? It sounds like that because of the content. And so it's extremely important that this whole discussion, this character discussion, be continued. But we're coming up on time, and I do have one final question that was texted in, two that were texted in, one very early and one just now. So I'd like to get to those. But I want to thank you for your question and what you had to say. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dennis.
Okay, so we're going to go now to two questions. And I'll just give it to each one of you, one for each one of you guys. One says, please forgive my naivete, but is it better to listen to poorly composed classical music versus no classical music at all? That's one question. That's from Chris in Panama. And then the other question is, is music going to suffer the same fate that poetry suffered? If it can be prevented, how can you quickly verse people in the language of music? Of course, we're going to have to tell people about the fate of poetry, so let's take that up. How can you teach people to, quote, hear what's between the notes, as Lynn so often put it, or in other words, to hear what can't be heard or isn't being heard? Okay, so that's that question. Is music going to suffer the same fate that poetry suffered? If it can be prevented, how can you quickly verse people in the language of music? And so on. Okay, so which would you, and this should be seen as sort of concluding remarks, so anything else you guys want to say, please say it in the context, well, you either are taking up those questions or, in responding to anything else you've heard tonight.
Okay. It's don't worry about it's the same question as the spirit you have when you get up every morning. If you need to be able to tell jokes about the world just to keep your sanity. You can compose a decent joke, and you know the difference between that and a bad joke. So that can be done. When you go sing in a chorus, you'll struggle whether or not you're doing something for your ego or whether or not you're trying to hear that composer who's been dead for a couple hundred years, physically dead, but alive, whether you can bring him alive or not. That dialogue process goes on all the time, and we can't answer questions about do you listen to not good, well composed not well performed classical music versus not listening at all. Don't listen at all, but you better be doing something classical, when you're staying away from the bad performance. So there's just been a tendency to put at arm's length this funny question about classical culture, and for that matter, beauty. The thing about beauty is that there are things going on inside each one of us that Edgar Allan Poe put this on beauty, that it's where you touch the immortality of your soul, a certain poignant sad quality that you're never going to be, that the most intimate things about your soul are never going to get fully realized in this physical world. But you let that beauty in so you can actually accomplish your mission in life. That's what I was trying to say about Beethoven is right. People run into these problems all the time, and they usually say, I'm not that person. But it's just a matter of saying, there's things that inside me that impel me to avoid that fight, and that it can't always be done. Sometimes you have to say, if I have to change myself and change my image of myself and figure out what powers I have inside me because it's necessary to get this done for humanity, then that's more about classical music than anything else.
Okay, and my response would be, I don't know why the question of listening to poorly composed classical music versus nothing at all would even come up. But my answer is no. Look, this forum is called Beethoven, President of the Human Mind. We're looking at Beethoven because with the trouble that this world is in and the complete collapse of culture, you got to reach for the highest. You're not going to sit down and listen to Daniel Gottlob Turk or something like that and find it. You've got to reach the best that humanity has ever provided, and that's Beethoven. And that's, when you're listening to a presentation on Beethoven, I really suggest that the caller from Panama look into Beethoven. And as far as poetry goes, Lyndon LaRouche said a long time ago that the setting of classical poetry to music is the Rosetta Stone for both poetry and music. We will learn a lot about poetry from looking at how it's been set to music. We will learn a lot about music from examining poetry. David has participated in readings that I've been involved in of Edgar Allan Poe. You'd be amazed how he discusses the musicality of poetry. And I think that looking at them together, looking at music and poetry together, is certainly a fruitful way to go in which you're going to help revive a lot about poetry and music.
We have someone who has gotten into the queue. Basically, everybody stayed with us pretty much all night. So I'm going to let this person ask the question. Let's see what it is. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Brian in Houston. I have a question. There's a magazine that did a research on C256, A equals 432. That it's called Journal of the Society of Arts, March 5th, 1880. And they did research going back in 1860 something or other. But I want to know if anybody knows why would they call that pitch at C256, A equals 432, the philosophical pitch. Anyways.
Are you saying that you read an article in which that term is used to refer to that pitch?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody know about it?
Is the objection to using the the rational, well, I guess the rational ratios, the 8/5, to get from 256, not that it's not going to get you to 432, or is there some other issue there? It does fall a little bit short.
Yeah.
A few people just use the natural fractions. The Society of Arts, this is a group from the what they're picking up on, was debates in basically Beethoven's amanuensis, a man named Schindler, after 40 years of putting up with the Congress of Vienna situation in 1815, where they brought in these jacked up brass instruments and they had brilliant effects, and they didn't get two hoots about vocal registration or where the pitch was being. They get in 1855, Schindler just finally couldn't put up with it anymore, and he said, "Look, this is where the pitch got jacked up." And there was conferences in the late 1850s in France and England on restoring the tuning. I think the Society of Arts is reporting on some of that. Later on, it came up again with Verdi in Italy in the 1880s. But there's a lot more than what we can talk about tonight. But the core of this thing is it's in 1722 with Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. The tuning is not a mathematical thing. The tuning is whatever you have to do with the 12 keys and the 24 major and minor 24 keys to get them into a multiply connected relationship, each with the other. So they're in one universe. And you will bend a note one way or the other or not based upon that. So the best answer people can have on how to do the tuning is go master the Well-Tempered Clavier and master all the questions about how you think Bach went from one section of this discussion to another part of the discussion in those 24 and 48 pieces, and then see if you can hold them together, the whole world exploration, the whole, it's like Magellan going all the way around the world. You circumnavigated the whole tonal universe, and see if you can reconstitute how all those different keys fit with each other, and then you'll be singing it in tune. You'll be well tempering. Everything else is just some approximations of that.
One thing we might do, by the way, is to suggest for people some recordings and access to recordings of these pieces played so that they could do that, because this is a good time of year to do it. And frankly, if you're going to be doing something like the 48 of the Well-Tempered, because it's two volumes, of course, also, then it'd be good if people knew, whether that's like different artists that we could propose. Fred, you have any response?
Just that, look, we call it scientific tuning, and it's not unrelated to the question of whether music is scientific. We've tolerated unscientific music, the compositions of Liszt, Bruckner, Wagner, et cetera, and so you kind of got an anything goes type of mentality, and therefore people say, well, why does it matter? But it does matter, and it comes right back to the human voice, which you mentioned at the very beginning. The pitch was determined by the human voice, and that does not change. The human voice does not change. The places where the register shifts take place are relatively fixed, and therefore you need a tuning that is appropriate not only for the human voice, but for the type of beautiful music that the human voice can make. That's all.
Okay, very good. So I want to thank everybody for being with us. I want to thank, obviously, Fred and David. I'll say just the following in terms of where we stand. Obviously, we're doing this in the middle of a very, very dire circumstance on the planet. We are actually on sort of the verge of maybe not thermonuclear war, but a series of conflicts, or at least tensions that could, in fact, result in something like that. That's why we had this conversation tonight, so that this level of discourse could begin. This Saturday, we'll be taking this up. We will have a few of our members who've been dealing particularly with the Russia and China aspects of the problem to just have that discussion. I'll be moderating. and we invite you to be there at 2 o'clock to hear that. But as we go, and we want to just say thank you to, of course, everybody that listened and the questioners. It's very difficult, different level of questions and character questions that we've had with this. But think about thinking like Beethoven and what Lyndon LaRouche would have meant by that. We direct you to go to things like his article, Beethoven as a Physical Scientist. There's a book also called Think Like Beethoven, which has a collection of Lyndon LaRouche's articles on it. And if anybody has further questions and wants to reach either Fred or David, please feel free to get in touch with us through the LaRouche organization, also through the Schiller Institute, or your own individual organizers. Okay, so on behalf of the LaRouche organization and the Fireside Chat, I'm going to say good night, and we hope to see you, of course, this Saturday, and otherwise next week.